Well, hello and welcome to CDO Magazine interview series. I am Maribeth Achterberg with Molson Coors and a member of the CDO Magazine Global Editorial Board. In partnership with CDO Magazine, MIT CDO IQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers, we are offering a series of interviews with thought leaders in industry. And today, I have the pleasure of talking with Mark Panthofer. He's the VP of DevSecOps and Cloud at nvisia. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
On the technology front, what are the architectural patterns that are becoming more prominent?
Well, I think we've all, heard an awful lot about microservices, right? So now microservices, sort of in the strict definition, is probably a little less prevalent in most organizations. So when it comes to the architectural patterns, some of the key things that I would point out really start with how organizations are running in the cloud. So many organizations that are, very few organizations don't have, almost everyone has a presence of some sort in the cloud. And so the question is, when was that established? Is that, to current standards? So what we see there from a sort of architecture perspective, from a cloud architecture, is the prevalence really of hub and spoke architectures. And these are developed where you have, particularly from a data perspective and data flow in and out of the cloud, you have this centralized hub. And from a networking and data perspective, you can manage that data and things coming in and out of the cluster or out of your cloud in that sense. So that was kind of a missing piece because a lot of the early applications or cloud instances that people had really were sort of shadow IT in many cases, or they were just put together to respond to something probably in a little bit more of a hurry. And of course, the other problem, and this is kind of organizational, another reason for the platform engineering, the rise of that, is a lot of the early teams, you had very passionate people with a lot of grit to get things up and going and running. And that profile was the kind of person that likes to plow new ground and not, sort of care for it and nurture. So a lot of the folks that set up these initial environments are gone. And we were I've been coining the term, I guess, really the ghost ops, really for coining a term for that. But in what happens is you really sort of need to get that cloud architecture correct. And again, from a data perspective, think about data flowing in and out of the cloud and being able to manage that through a single area. And so that's really kind of the starting point. The hub and spoke architectures, and really the use of the cloud adoption framework style landing zones. What this does is creates what we effectively refer to and sort of the cloud architecture arena is a blast radius. It creates a very tight blast radius. So essentially, each team, each environment gets its own landing zone. So really its own cloud presence. Now, all of these bits, these landing zones are part of the spokes in a hub and spoke architecture. So they are still all controlled, everything in and out of them and managed, but it allows the teams to sort of shift left and have the autonomy around innovation and to start getting involved in and specifying more about the environment they operate in. So that's a key one. And once you sort of get that laid out, what we've seen, that's kind of step one. And a lot of times we end up with customers, clients actually helping them migrate to that model. So they'll have some early representations of it, but a lot of times they'll only have a small handful of either accounts or subscriptions that are for the entire enterprise. We like to see that far more granular, much more down at really an environment level. So app team A's dev environment has really their own account or subscription. Where we can manage not only access and the resources that are in there with policies, but cost as well. It helps really to you don't need a lot of fancy tools when you have things, sort of broken down that way. But then the real challenge really becomes to changing the way application development teams function, the way they think, the way they execute in this sort of more cloud native environment. So, previously they were just connecting back to a central database that had, or data instances that they had set up by the central data team. And if they could connect, they were compliant essentially, right? So now they have to really think a lot more about that when they're working through it. And so anyway, so then other things that from an architecture perspective, from around data, is not just, okay, the platform engineering team is going to stand up, a SQL Server database for me in my Azure account. But then it really starts to get into, well, what about things like event streaming and event-driven architecture? And so, that's still data, right? And that's still things, those are things that need to be thought about and managed and governed. And sort of the last bit on the architecture of data that we see is also looking to move toward more open standard platforms where they can actually use something like Kubernetes as dial tone. So I can deploy my database actually into a cluster and bring it up, down, and manage it. And it's the entire database with my releases. And it's really a powerful thing. And it can, in the long run, end up saving organizations a lot of money. But it also requires some expertise, around that. And so that's not something you want to start with, right? But that's kind of the evolution, I would say, from architecture, getting the cloud right, getting these landing zones set up.
So in all of the information you've just given us is fantastic. How does an organization that kind of runs in this traditional on-prem environment right now take everything you've just said and think about moving, into this microservices environment to achieve that fluidity and faster time to value? What should they be looking for? What's their first thing? You mentioned a few things about really thinking about that modernization, but what would your advice be to them for the first thing they should be doing?
Well, first of all, the cloud part, right? So setting up your first landing zone, you're not trying to implement like the sort of perfect beat all end all production environment. What you start with is really focusing on getting something running in a dev cluster, for instance, with Kubernetes as an example. So there's a lot of layers to this. And one of the mistakes that organizations try to make is, well, let's get everybody completely up to speed on all these technologies, and then we'll get started. Much better off to sort of do that in layers and look at flow. So in other words, the goal is to get an application, a containerized application running in a dev cluster. And so you're not worried about every security aspect yet, because a dev cluster has no external endpoints. It would be really kind of no different than thinking about running it in your current environment, just in a dev environment. But getting that flow from the standpoint of a developer, starting to, okay, I build my application, I can test this locally, and build it in containers. I push it, my code, it gets picked up by the pipeline and gets deployed in a very simple way to start with, just to my dev cluster. And so start establishing flow. And by the way, this is not that what I would call novel. We're really just following DevOps principles, right? So the idea of flow, feedback, and continuous improvement. So we really want to get a group of folks, your initial group of folks, comfortable with that idea. And so that now you're kind of you're raising the water and lifting the development team boat, the platform engineering team boat, and then all the other constituents that really are riding along with the platform engineering team. And again, that's your ops, networking, et cetera, because they're providing specifications and continually adding to them and building on them, because you can't do everything for day one, you'll fail, right? So putting some initial basic things there around networking, for instance, NSGs. And so making sure that that's implemented properly with Terraform as an example. So again, so really doing this with really modest goals and then building on top of that. And in doing that, and we really refer to that as sort of building out capabilities. So even the training becomes pretty incremental. You learn the basics, then you get a chance to get your hands on it, you work with it, and then you sort of drive your learning path based really on the curiosity of the team, but also some guidance, of course, but really let them sort of drive that.
So folks, we've heard from a data thought leader today. I want to thank Mark very much for joining me in this interview. Please visit cdomagazine.tech for this and additional interviews with other data thought leaders from across the globe.